This Quoircast Podcast episode is brought to you by Heretic Happy Hour, whose tagline is burning questions, not people. Join hosts Sean DeJaw, December Rose, Dr. Reverend Katie Valentine, Keith Giles, and myself, Matthew J. DiStefano, for a happy hour filled with quality conversation, fine fellowship, and perhaps even a laugh or two. Unapologetically irreverent and crass, yet sometimes profound, we make sure to pull no punches and leave no stones unturned as we discuss the Christian faith. But listener, beware. There will assuredly be some serious sacred cow tipping. If that sounds like your cup of tea, or bourbon if that's your thing, head on over to heretichappyhour.com to stay up to date with us. And be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcast fix.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. This is Not Church. My name is Nat Turney. I'm one of your hosts. With me, as always, is my big hermano, John. Say hola, John.
Hola, John.
I can pull the bilingual stuff, man. Right? El hermano mayor, John. He's nestled up in the cozy mountains of Northern California, and I'm sweltering in West Texas. It's 105 today, John. Can you believe that crap?
It is
105.
It's maybe in the 40s here, and it's overcast and foggy as hell.
You can shut your mouth now. I'm dying, John. But here, this is summer in Texas, man. It starts early and it goes late, but here we are. We have an awesome guest with us today, and we just want to jump right into this conversation. But I want to welcome to the podcast Anthony Bartlett. Let me read you a little bit about him from his Amazon bio. And again, if this is incorrect, it's on him, really. It's not my fault. I'm just kidding. I'm just joking with him. But here we go. Here's a little bit about Anthony. So Anthony Bartlett read philosophy and theology at Heythrop. Oh my gosh. Athaneum in Oxfordshire, England. Did I say that even remotely correctly?
Heythrop Athaneum. You got both wrong.
We're off to a great start. And at London, I said that correctly, right? London. At London University. Following his ordination to the Roman Catholic priesthood, he spent a year studying in Rome. After 10 years of ministry, he resigned the official priesthood. In this period of transition, he lived in a community of prayer near Assisi in Italy under the guidance of writer and teacher Carlo Carretto.
Carletto.
Oh, I see. This is right off the page, though. It says Carlo Carretto.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, I thought so. Okay. So the experience, here we go. Around Carretto welcomed many different individuals at the crossroads of traditional Catholicism and the search for fresh perspective and spiritual practice. It was natural that news of a major recent book by René Girard and his extraordinary cross-disciplinary understanding of Christianity should arrive among members of this group. The seed of information planted then eventually matured into contact between Tony and James Williams, professor of the Hebrew Bible in the Syracuse University Department of Religion and a prominent Girardian scholar. With Williams' support and encouragement, Tony was accepted for doctoral studies in the department, emigrating to the U.S. with his family and gaining his degree in 1999, as well as being a founding member of Wood Hath Hope. He is the author of numerous articles and books, including Virtually Christian, How Christ Changes Human Meaning and Makes Creation New, and a new book called Signs of Change, which we're actually really here to talk about today. Welcome to the podcast. How are you, sir?
Very well. Thank you very much for the introduction.
I did my very best to stumble my way through it. And
I kind of tripped you up there a little bit. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. It's all right.
Yeah. We were talking about Satan before at the beginning, so that's the Satan.
Right. So Satan's always trying to trip us up. So
that's great.
Were you ever kind of an evangelical guy? It sounds to me like you sort of grew up in the Roman Catholic tradition, more or less.
I grew up. Yeah, that's a good question. I grew up in the Roman Catholic tradition, but for some reason or other, in my kind of heart, I suppose I was always evangelical in a way. I always felt a kind of direct connection to Jesus somehow or other, and so as a result, I did struggle with the kind of the layers of the church under which Jesus can easily be buried.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I would say that I probably was and am an evangelical, but of a certain kind, should we say? But then I suppose all evangelicals are of a certain kind.
Sure. I know we've talked at length, John and I, over the I don't know, I guess I could say years now, but we've talked about the term evangelical and whether or not it's rescuable from the lexicon, as it becomes more and more tied to us, usually to a very, almost more to a political ideology than to a religious one. I find myself, as I often do, stubbornly digging my heels in and saying, no, in the truest sense of the word, I am evangelical.
I sympathize with that. And because I didn't kind of grow up in an evangelical church, I don't really have some of that baggage there. I don't feel resentful in any way against the term. And I kind of like it, because it means of the gospel. So
yeah, that's the way I feel about it too. But I also know that here in the U.S. in particular, that term does carry a ton of baggage with it.
Right.
It does tend to, and for me as well. I mean, when it's been used for 30 years to describe a voting bloc more than anything really to do with the church at all. You talk about politicians trying to court an evangelical vote, and it's always, a certain particular, it's almost always leaning towards a more conservative understanding of everything, right? More fundamentalist. And I'm certainly none of those things. So, but I think I've skipped over our initial question that we tend to ask people. So we sort of try to slip in there a little bit with your faith background, but beyond just being raised sort of within Roman Catholicism, what else can you tell us about that journey for you?
Well, I joined novitiate, which is the name for the year of training for a religious order, when I was 17 years old. So I was pretty young and kind of very moldable, as the whole purpose of that is. You take people, I think Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuits, said, give me a child, I'll give you the man, kind of thing. And that's what happened to me. And so I started off when I was 17. But right at the time when I joined, something called the Second Vatican Council was at its height and was coming to an end as well. Now, I don't know if you ever heard of that, but it was a major watershed in the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah,
I would say it was a huge thing from which, in a way, Roman Catholic Church has not really recovered or straightened itself out from, if that's ever possible. But it changed everything overnight almost. And so I kind of joined something with a fairly conservative background and mentality. And then everything was up for grabs. I mean, literally, it was a revolution. It was a religious and social revolution within the framework of the Roman Catholic Church, and especially within the religious orders, male and female, at that time. And so there was a lot of turmoil. A tremendous amount of turmoil, really was. I mean, during the time I was training, and one of my first years as a priest, I've seen the statistic that 120,000 men left the priesthood. So there was a huge lot out of something like, say, 300 or 400,000 worldwide. It lost a quarter of its kind of officer class kind of thing, and there was so much upheaval at that time. So really, I kind of had to begin figuring things out for myself. And that's really the nature of the case, that I began a long, slow journey to try to understand what was meaningful for me in the person and the gospel of Jesus.
Yeah. So it's interesting because we just, like we mentioned offline, we had just had a really great conversation with John Dominic Crossan, and he left his religious order right around the same time. Yeah. And he cited that same, some of those same issues with that encyclical that came out, and he had found himself at odds with the Pope. Which for him wasn't a problem. He said, hey, he didn't, from his point of view, the Pope was a man. He was entitled to disagree with him. He said he's got it wrong. He's wrong. And how did he put it, John? He got it sideways with a cardinal, I guess it was. He goes, sort of like this happened. And I was, at the end of it all, I was an ex-priest and he was still the cardinal and he was still the Pope. So, that was the way it goes. He said he applied for, I forget the term for it, but to be dismissed from his order, and they pretty rapidly agreed that it was time. But I also thought, I could have swore I heard also or read that Brendan Manning left his order around that same time with some of those same issues being cited as problems. So it seems like you were in pretty good company. Yeah,
I mean, I was certainly in risky company. I mean, all sorts of crazy things. I was not just intellectual. I mean, people were, I don't know, like the thing certainly went off the rails for a while. I mean, if you were running an army or any kind of business, and you would probably have kind of come to a full stop at that time. It was a crazy period. And then, of course, John Paul II, you kind of remember him as a friend of Ronald Reagan, and to kind of swing against the Soviet Union with Poland's kind of liberation and all that kind of thing. That's when things started to get back on track again. So it was really between 64, 65 and 1980 that period of great turmoil was the case. But that was the time I was both training and a priest. So, but I'm thankful for it, because I think probably if all that hadn't happened, I would be a much less pleasant person than I am,
Right. That is what we're shooting for, right? Just to be, better human beings all around. Sometimes
that's right.
Sometimes that means we have to shed some of that religiosity to get there.
Yeah,
so
right.
I'm gonna let John here jump in a minute, but I had a question before I didn't want to forget. So before we jump into the book, which sounds like it has some fairly obvious Girardian themes, what was your first exposure to René Girard? Was it? Well, I'll just let you say it in your own words. How did that come about? It
was kind of like in that introduction that you read from Amazon. But when I finally took the decision to leave the priesthood and the religious order I was in, my superiors, that's the term we use for those who are in charge of the organization, said, "Well, you just can't leave. You have to spend a time of discernment." Now, I was really annoyed by that, but actually, it was a very, very beneficial time for me. So I went away to Italy, and I spent that time with Carlo Carretto, and he was a wonderful guy, and he taught me a lot, and he comes from the contemplative tradition very much, and he spent 12 years in the North African desert, and he had a very rich soul. So I learned a lot from that. But anyway, when I finished that year, I came home. I came back to England, and a friend that I had made in that time, he visited me in England pretty soon afterwards. A friend who was in the community, his name is Franco, he visited me fairly soon afterwards, and he brought me this book. And it was Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, but in French. Les choses cachées, sort of thing. And he says, "You've got to read this." So I didn't read it right away, but after actually 4 or 5 years elapsed, because I was actually working hard on another project. But then I began to read it, struggle through it in French, and it just blew me away. It really did. It was basically at the end of the 80s that I really encountered Girard. So that's pretty early for a lot of people. I've known Girard for a long time, and I met him for the first time after I joined the university at Syracuse, and I went on various conferences. So I met him in 94 and then afterwards, and he was an inspiring man, inspiring intellectual, a great, a premier intellectual, no doubt about it, a great thinker.
Yeah. One thing that I don't think, if you're not familiar, listeners, if you're not familiar, Girard is dense. He's deep. There's a lot of, it's hard to give a Cliff Notes version of mimetic theory, but we've talked about it with a few people on the show once in a while because it fascinates me. I see it as a very, very useful tool as far as understanding, especially understanding the origins of violence in our species, and some of the ways in which we've sacralized violence and turned it into something, in some ways very, very positive, right? We've looked at it this like as though, if not positive, something that has to happen as far as human evolution goes. And I think Girard would say not necessarily, but
yeah, I'm obviously biased, but I would say that Girard is the Plato of the 21st century. He has that standing that Plato really influenced every as they say, philosophy is a footnote to Plato, but I think Girard has changed the nature of the conversation enormously.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too, because I find this with scholars very often, that sometimes how they end up in their specific field of study is sort of roundabout way. So Girard didn't start out as a theologian, although he was raised in a religious household somewhat, but he was a literature professor, right?
Yeah,
so he starts noticing these patterns, right?
Actually, history. He started off in history.
Right. History.
In contemporary French history. And then he got a job teaching literature, and he'd never done literature before, so he just read the books before the semester began.
I just love that idea of literary criticism, and C.S. Lewis had a similar sort of upbringing, right? So you start looking at literature, and you start to notice, and I know for Girard anyway, was starts to notice these patterns of mimesis that he calls it. And he starts to notice these conflicts. There's always desire. There's always, anyway. So out of that, he comes up with mimetic theory.
Right.
And again, it's complicated somewhat. Although once it's explained well, and I have not done a good job, by the way, of doing that. Once it's explained well, it's one of those things you can't unsee, though, right? If you've ever seen two kids in a room play over one toy, you've seen mimetic theory in action, right?
That's it.
There's one thing, I don't really want it, but as soon as somebody else wants it, well, now I want it.
Yeah.
And
when I started reading Girard, I told you that I didn't start reading him immediately, but by that time I got married and I had a couple of kids, and I was at home actually looking after kids. My wife was doing nurse training, and so I had one day a week when I was off, and we had a babysitter at that time, and I would listen to and then watch my daughter and her friend, who was the daughter of the babysitter, out in the yard. And I was reading about mimesis, and I could see what happened was that my daughter, whose name is Susanna, she would start playing in a little car, little pedal car, and her friend just said, "I want to play in that. I want that car. I want that car." So Susie is my daughter, and being a good Christian, she says, "Okay, you can have the car." So then she starts playing on the bicycle, the little trike, and then the friend says, "No, I want the tricycle. I want that." So then Susie has to give that up, and then there's something else. There's a scooter or something, and literally that's what happened. And until eventually Susie ended up with the car that she'd left in the first place, because everything she touched became desirable, and the thing that the other one wanted because she touched it, because she was using it,
Right.
And it could flow the other way as well.
Well, there's that cycle that begins to happen, right? Where because somebody wants it, now my desire for that thing is validated, which makes me want it more, right? And so it escalates. And so we see this obviously, this is a very micro level we're looking at, but on a macro level, we see this happen within culture and society, where eventually things come to a head, right?
Absolutely.
And you either have violence outbreak outright, or you have something that comes along as perhaps a valve, like an escape valve. And so we look at the scapegoat mechanism that comes in and says, okay, well, if we just focus all of our attention on this one bad actor, we can, at least for a time, right?
Yeah.
And it's always right. Go ahead.
About Hitler, that, he had two wars. One was against the rest of the world, basically, and the other was against the Jews. So the Jews were the scapegoat, and the war was the kind of like the escalation, the explosion of violence. But he had both things going, and they say, well, he kind of almost won he lost the World War, but he almost won the war against the Jews, in that way of what he set out to do, the massive slaughter. So we've had that played out for us, that mechanism which you just described, and arising from something as simple as I want the thing that my friend is playing with, and there's only one of it, and so we're going to fight over it. Arising from that basic mechanism, you get something as catastrophic as the Second World War and the Holocaust. So it's a huge mechanism which Girard is able to enable us to understand.
Well, then just so we play this out now, we won't spend our whole time talking about Girard. I just find it for me, it's still fascinating. But what I remember, it might have been Girard said it might have been someone speaking about Girard, but essentially what we have in Jesus then is we have a failed scapegoat.
Yes, absolutely.
Because scapegoats are supposed to stay dead.
Yes.
And so in the resurrection, and also in this idea that we now have a model that is actually worthy of being emulated in Christ, we have this, at least the possibility, right? The potential for the cycle to be broken. What's your take on that? Is that
that's absolutely right? And the only thing that I've added, Girard, kind of his major argument was that the biblical literature, all the way from Genesis through, revealed the scapegoat. So it was a kind of revelatory thing that little by little you see these figures like Abel, you see Joseph, you see Job, and the suffering servant, and then you see Jesus. It's a revelation of the victim. But I said, I added, I think it was implied in Girard, but it wasn't really kind of worked out fully. But it's really, really critical, especially when you get to Jesus, that the response is nonviolent. That Jesus himself not only was the victim, but he was a non-violent victim. He did not retaliate. He did not respond in kind, because you really couldn't have if the moment Jesus kind of lost it and said, "Okay, I'm really upset with you guys. I'm going to come with an army next time." Then there's no revelation. There's nothing. He's just another liberator, messianic figure, etc., but he's using the same mechanism as everybody else. So there's something deeply different about him.
That was what Dom Crossan pointed out to us, because he's written this book called Render Unto Caesar.
Yeah.
And he's dived deeply into Revelation, the book of Revelation, because for him, that is the antithesis of the gospel message. What we find in Revelation is exactly what you just described, is Jesus coming back, and now he's like every other emperor. He's like every other conquering king. This time he's coming back with a sword. And so for him, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I'd say that's a certain reading of Revelation. Right. No, and he was clear about that. It's if you read that very literally, but,
exactly right.
It's very interesting to me that's usually what is used. That's where you find some of this justification for violence, as it comes.
But they ignore the last 2 chapters, the last 2.5 chapters, where everybody is invited into the city. The gates are open day and night. The kings come in, bring their glory in, and the nations are healed there. And so there's kind of like two. It's prismatic. You look at the same thing from different angles, and on the one hand it looks fine, but on the other hand it's not. And I think that's the final message of Revelation is one of non-violence. The Lamb who is slain who actually stands as one who is slain, is always a revelation of non-retaliation.
Yeah, for sure.
But that's very disturbing to the world. I think that's the point. It's very, very disruptive.
Well, it's disruptive in the fact that we just don't like it, right? I know a lot of people, bristle at the idea somehow of a non-retributive God, because still in the back of their minds, and I wrestle with this as a pastor all the time, because what I preach all the time is that God is non-retributive.
Right.
That there is no hell of eternal conscious torment waiting simply just to punish people for being bad or for missing the point, because that's just not how God does business. I don't believe he's retributive in nature. I believe he's restorative.
Right.
But there is still this sense of justice in our minds that we can't wrap our heads around, a justice that does not look like punitive justice.
Right.
I need a justice where the bad guy gets what's coming to him and the good guy gets rewarded. And it does. Yeah, you're right. It's very disruptive to our sense of right and wrong and whatever sense of justice, aka vengeance, it seems like that we have. But
as you're talking about, justice, right, and punitive justice, which is so American or so Western, this idea that the only way we can get justice is through violence, and it seems that in doing this, we had to change the MO of Jesus. So for us to continue to move forward with this violent form of justice, this violent form of revenge, the John Wayne-esque look at how we treat people who do us wrong, we had to change this idea of what Jesus was going to do when he came back. And I think, within Girard and within mimetic theory, that's super easy to show that, we just go eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And regardless of what that really meant, we're just going to go off on this tangent. And then you end up with like what just happened recently, which just happened the last couple of days of this shooting, right? And this, and this idea that there is some group of people who are going to undermine our ability to be who we are. And we play this martyr syndrome of, if I can't be me, then you can't be you. And I'm going to, God damn it, I'm going to come around and I'm going to kill you all. And, but what is confusing to me is specifically within the conservative party, this inability to see the danger, the long-term danger in what is happening here.
I mean, you're absolutely right that we've transfigured and disfigured Christ, Jesus, over the centuries. back into a violent mold. And it kind of testifies. I mean, there's a bad side to it, and then there's a good side. The bad side is, how can we have missed the point for so long? And the good side is that we are actually seeing the point now. And the reason why we didn't see it for so long is because violence is so structuring. It's so generative. It makes the world work. But now, just what you said there, it's more and more exposed for being a dead end. Like, it's always going to be cyclical, and there's always going to be another. You're going to have to find another bad guy or bad group to destroy, and there's no end to it.
Well, let's dive in then from all of that background, Signs of Change, right? Or the book that is now available, right? It is out it is out for sale.
Yeah,
discusses some of this as well. But if you wouldn't mind, give us an idea of what that book deals with.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to do that. And I'm privileged to be on your podcast and to have a chance to talk about Signs of Change, because the book is kind of like, should I say, the dearest to me. I mean, I haven't written a huge number. I've written 4 or 5 or something like that, plus a novel, I'm not half as productive as others, but getting to this point of Signs of Change is a kind of end of the arc for me, because the other books, so I wrote a book called Cross Purposes, and that came out of my research for my PhD at Syracuse University, and it actually does the deconstruction on the theory of what became substitutionary atonement in the Reformation, and before that was satisfaction atonement through Anselm. I kind of really went to town, and I always wanted to do that, to try to undermine that. But then I hadn't put anything really positive in its place. And so there's been an arc of development since then. And I've come to this step by step to this understanding. It was always there in a kind of germ, but is that the business of God, the business of the God of revelation, as Christians understand that God to be, the Father, Mother of Jesus, the business of that God is to change the way human beings are. It's not to get us to heaven as such. It's to transform the living space of human beings into heaven, into that seamless relationship of love, which is what we see figured in the Trinity. That's the wonderful image of persons in perfect communion with each other. So the business of God is to change that. So the question then is, how do you do that? How do you break in to the human system with something that is so radically different? So we talk about the saints, and these are exceptional individuals. Yeah, especially in the Catholic tradition, although I do believe there's certainly evangelical saints. So, people have really done this thing, and they've gone the whole 9 yards kind of thing. But that you're going to actually change humanity as such, the way human beings do business. That's foolish. That's utopian. But any other idea of God doesn't really make sense, because if you think about it, if God is not communicating to us another way of being, then God is just a kind of amped up version of ourselves. If he's just bigger and larger and more powerful, then I got no real reason to respect him. That's the way. I could do that. If you gave me the same armor as you got, I could be God. And of course, human beings do. But if God is breaking in with a completely different way of relating, which is of this infinite self-giving, infinite compassion, infinite undoing of violence, then of course, yes. Then you say, well, yes, only God could do that. Only a revelatory spirit that could show us that is worthy of the name and the worship of God. Nothing else takes my heart away from myself and says, you can truly be different. And of course, then we say that Jesus is the figure, is the one who revealed that. But then you still have to have the mechanism by how that happens. Because if I say to you, so this is the argument that develops. So if I say to you, well, you have to be different. You have to be non-violent. You have to be non-retributive. And you can set that up as a kind of ideal. It's still something that I have to conform to externally. And I can be better at it than you. I can be more righteous at being non-violent than you, and then of course it becomes an object of desire, and then we're in conflict. And that obviously can happen among Christians all the time, like a competition in virtue. And it's very much the case of our, they call it virtue signaling, that we're always trying to be better somehow or other as regards the victim in our culture. But anyhow, the point that what I worked at was that God, or the Bible, should we say, as that kind of tool that is there in front of us. I mean, like the Bible, got one right here. This big book, this book it's just an immense set of linguistic signs and stories and figures that all grip our imagination. And what is happening in it is that little by little, God is changing the signals by which we know what is happening in the world and what is good in the world. Because if we start off with human beings at the time of the Exodus, I mean, this is what I start off with in Signs of Change. I start off with the Exodus, that if God was going to begin a process of transformation in humanity, whereby we are translated into something very different, then it has to begin with a kind of liberation. And it's very difficult to conceive how that liberation is not going to work at some level, except through violence. So there is the killing of the firstborn, there's the crossing of the Red Sea, there's the invasion of Canaan. However that went, I mean, it's the way it's recorded in the Bible, there's lots and lots of violence. And so it sets everybody off on that track. Oh yeah, God's got God's plan, and it's going to come about by major killing. But it's only the first step, and then little by little, as I explain in Signs of Change, little by little questions. So if I want to really set you free from, shall we say, unrighteousness, whatever that, from not being right, then I have to work at it. I have to show you little by little the way and what that really means. Because if it's external, if it's enforced by law, if it's enforced by violence, then there's no real change that's going to occur. So little by little, over the story of the biblical story, and this is that's what constitutes the chapters of the book, the different chapters on Exodus, Genesis, Job, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, all the way through to Jesus and Paul. What I'm showing is that little by little, it becomes evident that to set human beings free from their disastrous way of being, you have to reveal nonviolence. You have to reveal nonviolence as a way of being. And the first steps of that happen really in the time of the exile, in the 6th century or the end of the 7th century. Little by little, it becomes, especially in the exile itself, with the figure of the suffering servant or the nonviolent servant, as I term it, it begins to see that it's actually by non-retaliation, by not replying in kind with what is being done to you by the Assyrians, by the Babylonians, by whoever it is, the latest big bad boy on the block kind of thing, the one who's got the most muscles, not replying in kind, that suddenly there's this, who would have thought the arm of the Lord would be revealed in this way? It says in that, who would have thought it? And suddenly there's this breakthrough. We begin to see that by my servant suffering, many are made righteous. That there's a transformation. So, and it's not a compensatory, the way I read it. in Isaiah, this is the suffering servant is not compensatory to God's offended honor or wrath, which is what we got from the Middle Ages, and is a really wrong track. What we get is a revelation of another way of being. And then when Jesus comes, we're basically 5-6 centuries later, he saw all the way through to the bottom of that, and he said, I'm going to run with this. This is what I'm going to do. And there were other signals in there, especially from the book of Daniel with the Son of Man, that kind of thing. So there's this, what I call a semiotic pathway, a series of signals and signs and kind of meaningful figures and hints that push you along the road until you get to the revelatory and transformative figure of Jesus. And then we have this amazing thing that his story is turned around in the resurrection. And then there's this pouring out of a sense of what all that means, what we call the Holy Spirit, that suddenly other people can get it. They can get this thing. And they first of all term it, the first name they give it is I'm forgiven. I'm forgiven for my sin. That Jesus died for me, Christ died for me, for in order that I may be righteous before God. In other words, forgiven. But that also implies non-retaliation. God is forgiving. God does not retaliate. God is not holding our faults against us, our sins against us, but is trying to reconcile us to God's self. Then that implies immediately that the response of the Christian is also non-retaliatory, non-punitive, non-retributive. And of course, that basically is the history of Christianity for the first 3 centuries. I mean, that's what happened. They did not revolt. They did not try to arm themselves against Caesar. It's a marvelous record. So that broke into the world. And it's always been there, but it got transfigured and defigured over the centuries. But now, because we're in this time of kind of world war, really, I mean, we're almost like in a perpetual world war. We're preparing for it, and we've got the mechanisms for it. That the deeper message of Jesus, I think, has found its time, its moment. All these things, the Spirit will reveal to you. So I think this is a very important moment, a revelatory moment for us. And the signs of change takes you through step by step over that process of transformation. And the book before it, just to add on, I'm going to stop, just to add on, the book before it, The Theology Beyond Metaphysics, sets the table really in terms of the what you might call the science of semiotics. It tries to show that there has been a thought of the way in which human beings communicate through signs, what that means, and how that has arisen basically in the Christian era and has become more and more prominent over the last 2 centuries. So it's like beforehand we talked in terms of these eternal truths, and there's still kind of a role for that in a way, but like heaven, hell, God, the devil, all that stuff, these big motifs, and they're all up there. They're all kind of like standing on top of us, controlling, and we try to control the universe with them. But in fact, what the nature of the Bible is this progression of stories and figures, of signs and signals that change our mindset, change the neural configuration. I think it gets down to neurobiology at the end, but that's taking us a little bit far. But anyway, it is actually changes the way in which we are as flesh and blood human beings.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot in there. What I've come to understand for me is that for me, there's a trajectory to the biblical narrative, right?
Right.
And that's the one thing that I see if you're coming out of or beginning to maybe turn away from a more fundamentalist or literalist approach to Scripture, one of the things that you abandon, first of all, is this sort of flat narrative where, we have this tendency to do this a lot, where we just flatten the text out. Every sort of part of this bears equal weight, and it just can't be right. For me, a richer understanding has come as I've seen this trajectory that culminates, right? in the person of Jesus. And, you know, and when I have conversations with people about, you know, since I do reject some of the more mainstream evangelical motifs of heaven and hell and, you know, penal substitution and all this kind of stuff, it's like, well, then what was the point of Jesus? Well, gosh, I hope there was more to it than just, you know, saving you from some imaginary torture chamber. How about Jesus comes to show us what it means to be fully human? You know, a completely new way to be human that shows us we could be. And I love the idea of Jesus as nonviolent, but I'm leaning more into a notion of him as being nonviolently resistant. And the only reason I make that distinction is because I don't want to draw a picture of Jesus as passive.
No.
I don't see his nonviolence as passivity at all. It is a way of disrupting the cycles of violence with your own nonviolence.
Right.
And we see this and I can't wait to talk to some others about this, but you see this, at least for me, I see it most clearly in the civil rights movement here in the United States, where you saw people literally put their lives and their bodies on the line in an effort to not be retributive and to not, you know, play into the narratives that were spoken about them. And all of a sudden, in a really radical way, you saw some change happen. And I really see Jesus as being that kind of figure. Would you agree also that the first 2 or 3 centuries of the church might have been its most effective time period? You know, I mean, this is when, you know, it seems like they took over the world in a few short years with a bunch of illiterate sort of, you know, peasantry.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it was explosive. I mean, like the growth of the movement was explosive. They say by the end of the 3rd century, it was 10% of society. I mean, it doesn't sound a lot, but actually, in terms of the integrity of the movement and the levels of society it reached to, it was the most consistent, coherent group
right.
in those centuries. And no wonder Emperor Constantine said, I need some political movement. I need some political outfit that is going to take me to the next level. Oh, Christians can do that.
So these guys, but that nonviolent stuff's going to have to go.
He got rid of that pretty damn quick. Sorry.
Damn quick, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to bring up is, so, you know, thanks to Constantine, right, we have a completely different trajectory. And then you fast forward to now.
Yeah.
And how do you even combat this idea that, okay, so we're always talking about empire, right? So the Bible is showing us time and time again that empires will come and they will try to destroy us. And then, so Jesus is trying to show us this new way, this nonviolent resistance. And then how do you wrap your head around a nation like the United States that is the empire? It's not the New Jerusalem. It is the empire in this scenario, but at the same time professing that it's a Christian nation. So they're using Jesus as their launching pad towards what they think is their greatness. And so
it's the weirdest thing.
Yeah.
How could one thing get transformed into its opposite? You know, like, I mean, even in the Roman Empire, in Roman society, I mean, you there was nothing. You had the gods, but they were all equally stupid, really. I mean, like, and so you really couldn't get hold of one god and ride with that god to the. But Christianity is so, as I say, has this coherence to it. So if you and strength to it, and so if you want to create a new empire, and Constantine began it, and really North America has perfected it. So they've taken this thing, and I mean the biblical word for it is the Antichrist, and they've changed it into its opposite. So, but the thing is, I think America is we emigrated to America in 1993. You know, we're naturalized Americans. Myself, my wife, and my children. We made a choice to come to this country, and I think it's an experiment in process precisely because of the grotesqueness of the way in which Christianity has been disfigured here, that the work is at hand. I mean, that's what we're engaged in. We're engaged in this long argument about the nature of Christianity, and that it has been transfigured and disfigured since basically the 11th century, and we've increased that and multiplied the layers, the hardened the surface of that, so that it seems so right, but it actually just enshrines incredible violence. It actually has amped up the violence of the world, because God has, rather than God transforming our human situation, God exacted the death of His beloved Son. The one who was most precious to Him. That by subjecting Him to this awful death, that's the only way in which God is going to be happy. And so, in other words, you've created this monster, but there is a logic to that. So what we're engaged in doing is, as you say, deconstructing that logic in order that this other logic of transformative love and compassion for the other may come through. So I think we're at a pivotal time, and the very fact that there are guys like you, and you're obviously not the only ones. There's many people kind of working at this level, trying to change the conversation, and it will happen. That's my belief, anyway.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, that's one of the things that I see. Again, not to overuse the word trajectory, but here we are. Well, I'll use it again, but that does seem to be the current trajectory, is the people who are, and again, there's always going to be those who are super comfortable with the status quo. It's working for them. It's providing them a living or whatever it is. But there are more and more people for whom that narrative no longer seems to make sense. It's not working anymore. And they're seeking out better answers, I think.
Right, absolutely.
And this is probably the story of Christianity over the centuries. I mean, this has happened more than once, and so we're not doing anything new.
Yeah.
It's one of those things when John and I talk to folks, we talk about deconstruction in general, and again, that's another term that has begun to be a little overused. But there is this sense from those who are entrenched in power that we're doing something novel, like because we're a threat. Like this is nothing new. I mean, gosh, as a Protestant, my entire existence is based upon somebody having found fault with the status quo and saying, no, let's do something different. Let's get back to whatever we perceive of as the roots of this faith.
Absolutely.
And then pushing against those things that we feel have corrupted it, or at least have the potential to corrupt it. And so that's what I am focused mostly on. I know that's what John looks at quite a bit. There is a movement, and I hope it's one that doesn't see itself as finding some place to end. You know what I mean? Like this is an evolutionary process. I don't see there being an end to it.
No, the advantage of people like you, and I'd say me as well, is that there's no big institution. There's no big organization.
Exactly.
Which any of us can have control of. It is a process of transformation, and we're agents of it wherever we are. And I don't see how you really could control it. I don't see how you could get hold of this.
You spend enough time talking to people, and you see that people are at various stages anyway. There's not some monolithic deconstruction movement.
Yeah, right.
There are people who are entering this at every conceivable level, and some are happy to question, a handful of things and superficial things, and some really want to rip the whole thing apart and start over again. And I think all of those are great. You know what I mean? I see that as a very personal, in some ways, very personal approach. But John's experience with this is a little different. He's had his issues with the church and left and come back and left and I think he's gone for good this time. But
I mean, the only thing I would say, and what I think that the modern evangelical fundamentalist church has seemed to forget, is that the religion that they are connected to is born out of revolution. This is born out of calling out status quo. I mean, Jesus was a revolutionary. And what it seems to me is that as we are calling for another revolution is basically what's happening right now, is like, hey, things have gotten a little out of hand. Things have gotten a little off the rails. And we are, for all intents and purposes, we are scaring the hell out of these, very entrenched pastors, leaders who have found that holding their congregation in some kind of status quo in a fear-based religion is is in danger of losing ground. I mean, we see this, right? That Christians are leaving the faith faster now than they have ever. And it's not that they are losing a connection to, say, a figure of Jesus, but they're losing a connection to these people who are telling them that they have the better answer for them. And these people are starting to actually ask some hard questions, and that's scaring the crap out of these leaders, right?
Yeah, I mean, the more power the right-wing fundamentalist Christians have, the more they're heading towards kind of self-destruction. You know, in as much as that, when you climb that ladder of power, like they have, you know, like they've got, I mean, I don't want to get too political here, but they've got control of the Supreme Court, that kind of thing. The more you're dealing in terms of the world and force and law and violence of it ultimately, and you're not showing anything new. In fact, you're showing the reverse. You know, you're just establishing yourself as the supreme power, and that leads to disillusion, scandal. You know, like this can't be it. Like you're saying, people are leaving, and it becomes sickening. You know, and meanwhile, the transformative gospel of a new humanity is just there. It's not trying to get the political power. It's not trying to move up the ladder somehow or other. It wants to. The point is, anybody in this place wants to communicate to other people. That's all we want to do. We just want to share with them this wonderful thing. I mean, and I think that's what you were talking about the first 2 centuries, 3 centuries. You know, like it's supposed. That's all they did then. I mean, there was never any thought of taking over the Roman Empire. There was never any thought of how can we get to the summit of the Roman Empire? It was the Roman Emperor himself who said, I'll make use of Christianity. There was never any Christian who says, let's devise a plan to get to the summit of power and then have power in the world. Of course, once they got power, it's very corrupting, but it wasn't part of the agenda. The agenda was just, you know, to stick with this message. And I think that kind of right-wing Christianity is its own downfall. It's its own doom is written into what it's doing. I mean, it's
and it seems like it's all but impossible for those who are entrenched in it to see that, though. It is it's blinding in a lot of ways.
Right. Yeah, it is.
And it's really, you know, once you've sort of stepped out of the matrix, it's easy to see it for the lie that it is. You go, oh, how can you not see this? But I was in it for 20 something years and didn't see it either. So there's a level of compassion that I try to bring to this that says, okay, people will see when they're ready. And for some folks, you know, and it was true for me. And I think it's true for a lot of folks. It has to fail before you start to find fault with it. And as long as it seems to be, at least on some level, working, then you can justify staying inside that system.
Right.
But once it starts to break down for you, you know, I think you're a little more free to ask some questions. But hopefully that seems to me like the thesis of the whole thing is this evolutionary process, right? This willingness of Christ to meet us where we are, this willingness of the gospel to meet us where we are, and then to transform us from that point forward, not to insist on, just immediate radical change, which I believe is possible as well. But I don't think that's the story for most people. I do think it's a process for most. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And I just feel it happening. And I mean, I know we've been here in the United States, as I say, from '93. We started our teaching and study group. It was initially called Wood-Hath-Hope. It was a quotation from Job, chapter 14. Wood has hope. Hath hope, but you have destroyed my hope. You know,
right.
Play on that. But right from then, it's hard. It's a hard row to hoe to keep trying to explain this other way when the default setting is so strong and is so kind of self-evident to people. That's what Christianity means. It means substitutionary atonement, or doing what the church tells you so you can get to heaven. It's a hard road to hoe, but my instinct is always that the language that we're using here, the conversation that we're engaged in, is so much more interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
It's so much more positive.
Yeah.
It's so much more human. it had so much more promise to it. You know, the other is like sucking on old socks, really.
And there it is, John, the title for the podcast. Sucking on old socks with Anthony Bartlett. Well, I like it. But you're right. You know, we just had this conversation with a friend of ours too, another writer. And we have, you know, I don't know if you get this way too, you know, you almost get to the point where you're just burned out on theology, right?
Yeah.
And just, you know, let's start talking about things in more human terms.
Yeah.
Let's talk about, you know, because for so long the church, I don't think was interested. Matter of fact, I would say was disinterested in producing better people. It wanted to produce more pious people, right? We wanted to make sure that we had the correct, but I remember pastors and people that were leaders in my denominations poo-pooing the idea of, oh, well, you think you're a good person. Well, there's no such thing. The Bible says there's such thing as a good person. And so the idea that somehow an interaction or an encounter with Jesus could actually make you a better human,
yeah, right,
wasn't even on the radar, right? But
right.
And then so the reason that I say this is a process too is I feel like as a culture, I think as a species, you know, we're addicted to violence. As a culture, it's baked into our DNA, right? And so this is why I'm talking to my friends and I'm saying things like, well, listen, we have to treat this like a heroin addicts, right? You don't just yank it all away tomorrow and tell them to go cold turkey. You know, we have to, you know, there's going to be a process where this begins to be unraveled from very structural parts of us. And we have to start seeing things very, very differently. And it's going to be tough. And there will be challenges along the way.
Yeah, I mean, if you use the figure of DNA, which everybody does, you know, in conversation, it's a contemporary trope. But it's highly relevant because DNA is a code. You know, it tells the body or tells the cell what to do and what it's going to create. You know, what the DNA is going to produce. It's going to be a cat, a monkey, or whatever, a fish, a flower. It's a physical semiotic code. So we've got this DNA baked into us, as you say, but it's a destructive DNA. So you need an alternative code. Right. And that can only happen, you know, like the mutations in the theory anyway happen one generation at a time. And let's hope it's a little bit faster than that, you know. But that it does take one mutation after another to suddenly you're in a position where you could be a different kind of creature. You know, you've evolved into something else. But it is so this is not a biological thing. We're not talking biology. We're talking communication. We're talking revelation. We're talking a different way of seeing and understanding what it means to be human in the world. And that's why the gospel has always been something that's spoken about, preached, written down, communicated. It's always a matter of communication. And Jesus was always doing that, you know, with his stories, his great stories. So that's the cultural DNA which has to be changed.
Yeah, and you're right. You know, it's almost like someone needs to come along and just insert some new, you know, let's take it like computer terms, like, hey, just just email somebody the right virus.
Yeah, right.
We'll overwrite some of this code we've gotten.
Yeah, really.
And because my wife and I were, weirdly enough, we were just in Kentucky last week for the Kentucky Derby, and you speak of communication, and I immediately think of these guys who were standing along the roadway as we were walking from our parking lot into Churchill Downs to watch this horse race, who were screaming at the top of their lungs that everybody walking on the path was going to hell.
Oh, really?
Communicating the gospel. You know,
yeah, right.
You know, they were upset. How many? I lost track. My wife actually just walked in the room. There were like 20 of them, right? I mean, like every street corner had some numbskull with a microphone and, you know, yelling about how, you know, going to the horse races was a sin, and we were idolizing horses somehow. And
well, the reason for there being 20 is because each of them know that their DNA, in that sense that we've been describing, has been surpassed.
Yeah.
It's already dead DNA. You know?
And they're just desperately clinging on to something, right? Some shred of relevance. Yeah, I think you're right. I sensed a lot of defensiveness in what they were doing.
Right, yeah. It's really offensive, but it is.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
Well, sadly, one of the reasons why this seems to be the norm is that we all, you know, we as me as a former evangelical or the evangelical fundamentalists, they believe that yes, there will be a time when they will be transformed, right?
Right.
when they are in the sweet by and by.
Yep.
Forgetting that Jesus says that we are to bring the kingdom here now. But they're willing to be hateful, murderers. The list goes on and on, because destroyers of the planet, because at some point they're going to be in this heavenly realm and with a new body and a new
earth, John. We get a new one. So just
so just fuck this one up.
This one down. Just drive it like you stole it, Ricky Bobby. I have to work that into every other podcast, John. I will have at least one quote from Will Ferrell. So anyway, hey, man, so I'm excited to read. I'm excited to read this. I did not realize it was already available, or I would have grabbed it.
You're obliged to read it now. You've had me on.
I'm absolutely obliged, and I will. You had me at Girard. You've kept me through the whole thing. This is one of the, for me anyway, it's been one of the seminal topics of discussion of the last 5 years for me, is how do we deal with this addiction that we have, the violence, and what does the Bible tell us really about how to move past it and how to, evolve into something that more resembles Jesus. And honestly, and sort of again, baked into that discussion is the discussion of how Christianity has been hijacked for other agendas, how people have come along, and it actually is, it's quite an amazing feat to have transformed this religion of peace, this faith tradition of the one we call the Prince of Peace, and somehow turned it into a violent, almost cult-like entity that just it's crazy. So
we're to the point where Jesus could stand next to every other MCU character and continue to battle, right?
Yeah. Well, and we're to the point where I think Jesus could walk into most Western, Protestant churches and not be recognizable, and maybe be ejected from the congregation. So
more than likely. Yeah.
I have to ask you to leave, sir. But anyway, I think your book and your work is important. If you guys have not had a chance, you know where to buy all the great books. We're not plugging, the big ones here. Anthony's got it in his hand right now. I'm sure it's available on your website, right, sir?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay. If all else fails, we know where to get books. We just don't like to say the word of, we don't like Jeff Bezos to get more money. But definitely check it out. I'm sure if you have social media, if you're on Facebook, I know you're on Facebook because we're friends on Facebook. Yep. And so there's lots of ways to connect with Tony and read about some stuff that I think is really transformative and potentially can move us forward in the conversation. So that's always what we're looking to do, is move the conversation forward, find some common ground. So we appreciate you, sir.
Well, it's been a privilege to talk to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.